Hi, everyone. It's very nice to be with you today and have the opportunity to speak about the topic of regenerative agriculture. My name is Paul Hrycyk, and currently I'm working as the Global Regenerative Agriculture Lead at an organization called PURE, based in Toronto. And a bit of background about me before we jump into the topic. I grew up in Kitchener-Waterloo and did my undergraduate degree at the University of Waterloo in geography and environmental management. And then I worked for Seeds of Diversity for about 3.5 years. Following that, I went to the University of Saskatchewan to do my master's degree in soil science. And since then, for the last 4.5 years, I've been working at PURE, which is a project development organization that works with producers and farmers to design, implement, and monitor regenerative agriculture projects around the world. And today I was asked to come and share a little bit about regenerative agriculture, and we'll spend the next 30 minutes or so going through some slides and talking about this topic. I always like to start with carbon. And the reason for that is because a lot of the driving interest behind regenerative agriculture can be traced back to carbon, especially when we hear from corporate organizations on some of the reasons why they're supporting farmers in their supply chains, for example, to implement these practices. But really why we like to start here is because of the amount of carbon that is stored in soils. And it's a large amount. There's actually more carbon stored below ground in soil than there is in all of the vegetation and the atmosphere combined. And what that means is that management practices or things that disturb the soil carbon pool can actually have some pretty major consequences in the release of carbon from that pool. But what I'm really excited about is the potential for agriculture to use practices that we'll talk more about today to transfer carbon from the atmosphere and CO2 into the soil via plants. And that's all done through photosynthesis. So regenerative agriculture really aims to improve soil health, and part of that is bringing carbon back down from the atmosphere into the soil carbon pool, which is a process that we call carbon sequestration. So if you were joining us today to find a definition for regenerative agriculture, I have lots for you to choose. And this is one of the challenges with regenerative ag, is that there's not an agreed upon definition or way to talk about what this term means. You can see here that different organizations have different ways to define this term. And while the term regenerative agriculture itself might be new, what it actually means, or the practices that it encompasses, is really quite old. In fact, you can really trace the roots back to the way that indigenous agriculture is used and produces food. And so the term really has gained a lot of traction in the last 5 years. And certainly in the last 2 years, we've seen more and more organizations, both from the certification side, NGOs, and corporate partners, define what regenerative agriculture means to them. And so now we have this growing list of regenerative agriculture terms and definitions, which can get a little bit confusing. But one thing that a lot of them have in common is the mention of soil health in particular. You can see here on the left side in this table, about half of the organizations that are sort of these practitioner websites, so these are the project developers, those that are implementing regenerative agriculture, they talk about soil health. But if you look at journal articles, almost 90% of them will mention improving soil health, organic matter, soil fertility within their definition of regenerative agriculture. Followed pretty closely behind is carbon sequestration, and biodiversity. You can see biodiversity is mentioned a little bit more commonly in the practitioner websites compared to journal articles, but these two terms often make up the definition of regenerative agriculture as well. And along with that is water, either water quality, watershed health, things related to improving water resources within farm boundaries and outside of them as well. And we see that in about half of the academic journals that would define this term. Livelihoods, unfortunately, is falling behind a little bit, which we hope to see included more in the term regenerative agriculture. If you think about all of these practices that could fall under the umbrella of regenerative agriculture, they're not going to be possible to implement and be sustainable over the long term if they don't provide positive economic returns for those producers actually implementing them. So regenerative agriculture as a system really needs to contribute to economic improvements or livelihood benefits at the farm level as well. Now, even though it's difficult to find a common definition, one of the things that you can find that does have similarities between the different regenerative agriculture definitions or the ways that it's actually implemented is these 6 principles, the sets of principles. And I'll use these today to sort of illustrate how different practices, sometimes referred to as regenerative practices, are linked to these different principles. And the idea here is that with adhering to these different 6 principles at the farm level, you can help to improve those ecosystem services. So improving soil health and its functionality, contributing to the enhancement of biodiversity area on the farm, protecting watersheds or restoring watersheds and water quality in them, and then creating long-term economic benefits for farmers as well is one of the principles on the list. So this is more of an easy way, I find, to talk about regenerative agriculture more broadly across different geographies, across different organizations as well that talk about this term. So despite the lack of alignment on definitions, we do find that there's more alignment on regenerative agriculture principles. And in terms of practices that can fall under this umbrella, this isn't an exhaustive list, but I hope it does include many of the most important regenerative agriculture practices. Now, I think it's important to mention at this point that there is a little bit of controversy, might be too strong of a word, but there's some disagreement on which practices are regenerative and even if practices should be referred to as regenerative agriculture practices. And the reason for that is recent studies have been able to show that the impact of some of these practices across different geographies or climate zones or even different topography and places on the farm have varying impacts. One example that I can demonstrate this with is cover cropping. It's a practice that we often think of first or high up on the list of regenerative practices to implement because it can do things like protect the soil and keep a living root in the ground for longer periods during the year. If you measure the amount of carbon that's being sequestered, so as the plant grows, it's adding carbon to its biomass, and as the plant dies and is put back into the soil, that carbon, some of it decomposes and some of it can end up back into the soil. But if you also measure the emissions of N2O from the decomposition and from growing of a cover crop, then the balance of the N2O and the CO2 that's sequestered actually doesn't create that much of a positive impact on the total amount of greenhouse gases that are removed from the atmosphere or sequestered. So differences in geography, differences in soil type, differences in the areas of the farm can impact some of the benefits from these practices. That being said, I still think it's worthwhile to go through a couple of these practices today, talk about them in a bit more detail, and describe how they can contribute to improving some of these ecosystem services related to soil, water, biodiversity, and GHG reduction or greenhouse gas reduction and sequestration on the farm. So that's where we'll go next. And we'll start with agroforestry. And agroforestry is a broader set of a number of different agroforestry models that I'll talk about. But really, it's a practice that deliberately integrates trees, shrubs, and other woody species with crops and animals on the farm. So basically, in the same management unit or the same area, you have this direct interaction between trees, shrubs, and either the crops or the animals that you're producing on the farm. And there's 4 different models that we often see. Alley cropping, which involves more of a number of different rows of trees planted within the field directly with Crops like wheat, for example, is one such model. Riparian zones are used, you can see that in the picture over here, to plant as buffers between production areas on the farm and waterways. So these can have a lot of benefits in terms of overall watershed health by intercepting nutrients that may run off from the field into the water. They also can provide benefits for aquatic life through shading and regulation of the water temperature. Windbreaks, you'll often see these driving around different parts of Canada, whether you're in the Canadian prairies, sometimes called shelter belts, or in parts of Ontario. And they are just lines of trees. They're often multi-story, so they'll be composed of a number of different trees planted in a line, often perpendicular to the prevailing wind. So what they do is they basically block wind from blowing across the field, which can cause issues with erosion. Another benefit that they can have is trapping snow, so they can help retain moisture during the winter, which then recharges some of the soil moisture in the spring. They have biodiversity benefits, and also in organic systems, they can act as sort of blocks for things like drifting of different chemical products onto the farm. And finally, silvopasture. So silvopasture is really when we talk about trees in combination with animals in a mutually beneficial way. So sometimes these trees can provide food and fodder for the animals on the farm. They also can provide benefits related to protection from the elements on a cold winter day or on a hot summer day, being able to shade the animals. And so at the bottom here, what I've done with each of these practices is just quickly talked about the 3 different principles that they really match to. So in this case, agroforestry can really help to conserve and rejuvenate natural resources, especially in the cases of something like riparian zones. They can also help keep soil covered and minimize loss by blocking wind and reducing erosion, or just being able to grow during times of the year where the crops can't, in cases of alley cropping systems. And a lot of these practices, they aim to create long-term viability and livelihood benefits for farmers. In the case of agroforestry, sometimes it's a more productive tree cropping system that could be planted, but in other cases, just maintaining topsoil and losing less nutrients per year from erosion can be a benefit for producers. Next is compost application. So compost could be a really big category here. Sometimes we even lump compost into a broader category of organic amendment application and include other things like different types of manures or other organic products that can be used to provide nutrients to the plants for crop growth. In the case of organic amendments, you're often looking at improving a number of different aspects of soil health and not just providing nutrients to crops to grow. I think we all know that a lot of mineral fertilizers are more efficient in terms of the amount of fertilizer and the percentage of a certain mineral. Urea is 46% nitrogen, for example. Being able to put that into the soil for crop growth really is a direct way to improve the amount of nitrogen available to crop. In composted products, the process of mineralization often occurs, so more decomposition of the total nitrogen to make it available for plants in a form that they can actually take it up. But compost has many more benefits aside from being able to apply some nutrients, both micro and macronutrients to plants. And a big part of it can be adding organic matter, which has a number of benefits for the overall physical health of the soil. You can increase water retention by adding the sponge-like material and retain moisture. You can also improve aeration and structural stability of the soil. You can improve sort of the soil aggregation when you have issues with that, which then in turn provides benefits to reduced erosion, or if you have issues with root penetration, compost can be used to improve soil structure there as well. And finally, there's many biological benefits that compost application can do to all of these lovely bugs and microbes in your soil and provide really a big food source for them. And I think we're just really only in the early stages of fully understanding the massive impact that soil biology has for soil health and plant productivity overall. And so having any types of products that really support soil microbial activity and promote soil biology is quite beneficial. And avoiding practices that really harm or negatively impact the soil biological health is something that is ideal to avoid. So with compost application, you can see at the bottom here, there's a couple of different principles of regenerative agriculture that are linked to this practice, including rejuvenating natural resources, reducing and replacing off-farm inputs. So not necessarily fully replacing in the short term, but over the long term, being able to replace some of those off-farm inputs that add nutrients to your crops for growth. And then finally, again, with improvements in soil health and increasing on-farm resiliency during extreme weather events like drought, by being able to retain a bit more moisture, this practice can help support long-term economic viability for producers. No-till or conservation tillage is another practice that we often see here. Conservation tillage generally is when there's about at least 30% of crop residues remaining on the surface after a tillage event. So no-till is the absence of tillage. Obviously, conservation tillage is just using different implements and agitating or tilling your soil less than you would in a more conventional tillage system. Now, this is a practice that we've seen get highlight for its benefits, and then a couple of years later, new research is published, and we see that there's actually maybe less of a benefit than initially thought. If you measure the benefit of no-till in the tillage layer in terms of how much carbon is sequestered, so for example, 0 to 10 centimeters or maybe 0 to 15 centimeters, depending on the tillage implement. If you just look at that top layer of soil and measure changes in how much carbon is in that top layer from 1 year to 3 or 5 years later, no-till seems to help sequester carbon. But if you extend how deep you're measuring carbon content down to 30, 40, 50, I've even seen some go down to 1 meter, then some evidence is suggesting that you have more of a relocation of carbon in your profile. So yes, you have more carbon accumulating in that 0 to 15 centimeter layer, but if you look at the 15 to 30 centimeter layer, you have some carbon being lost from that layer. So the overall impact is maybe not as great as initially thought with tillage. That being said, there are still a number of benefits for implementing this practice, really around reducing the amount of soil disturbance in the production system, while also keeping soil covered because you're not, putting in those residues or turning the soil and potentially losing soil to erosion during wind events. Now, this one is also a difficult practice to implement in a number of different systems, organics certainly being one of them, when this practice is really used to support and control weeds. And there's certain geographies where tillage also helps in the preparation for seeding, whether you're too wet or in some cases, like in California, tillage is required in periods where it's also quite dry. So tillage definitely provides some benefits in terms of retention of soil, but in terms of actually implementing this practice, it can be quite challenging for a number of different production systems and different geographies or climates. Cover cropping is really about growing plants in your field for the primary benefit of the soil. So a cover crop can be seeded after the growing season and sometimes winter killed if the species are not able to survive during the winter. Other times it can grow through to the spring before the next growing season and be terminated through tillage. It can be sprayed. It can be roller crimped, which is basically another piece of equipment that can go through the field and break the stalks of the different cover crop plants and kind of create a mat, which then kills the cover crop as well. But what's important here is that the biomass of the plants that are grown, that biomass then remains in the field afterwards. If you harvest a cover crop and remove the biomass or the seed heads or any part of the cover crop, then you are creating a loss in terms of the amount of nutrients that end up in the soil. So growing the crop obviously uses nutrients in the soil, and if you remove part of that crop, those nutrients are lost with it. So that's more about the crop rotation than it would be referred to as a cover crop. In other cases, cover crops can be used at different points of the year, or in perennial systems, a cover crop could be used and planted between rows of apple trees or in orchards. And this can be a number of different reasons to select different species as part of your cover crop mix. Probably one of the more common reasons is to use cover crops to fix nitrogen, and you would do that by planting legume cover crops. Peas, beans, other leguminous species like clovers can pull nitrogen from the atmosphere through symbiotic relationships with their roots in the ground, and be able to add a bit of nitrogen, not from the soil, but from the atmosphere itself. So in that way, you're getting kind of a little bit of a nitrogen credit. And as that plant is killed and decomposes, that nitrogen is released back into the soil for the subsequent plant to use. Now, it's only a small portion of the total nitrogen that could be released in the short term, but that nitrogen can build up and add up over the long term. Other types of cover crops that are higher biomass producing, different types of grass species, for example, they can be used to add significant amounts of organic matter into the soil. And then there's other types of cover crops that could be used, like daikon radish or tillage radish, that actually have a taproot that kind of drills down into the soil and can help with issues around soil compaction, or to break up some issues with root growth and root penetration if those are present in the field. And so by keeping the soil covered for longer periods of the year, it's protected from erosion, which you can hear me say a lot. Other benefits around nitrogen fixation can help to bring additional nutrients and replace some of the other fertilizers that would be required for crop growth. And finally, just having something growing and flowering during different parts of the year can have benefits for biodiversity. So really maximizing the different number of species or genuses of plants that are growing within the farm in a given year. And that leads nicely into a diverse crop rotation. This is something that we've seen become much more common in different parts of Canada, a continuous crop being grown in the same field year after year can have issues with just depleting the soil, really causing more intense issues with pest and disease. And by breaking up the cropping cycle through a more diverse, and when I say diverse, I'm not going to give a number, but if you look at different standards, some say having at least 3 crops in rotation is the minimum, and working your way up to something like 7, which can be a big challenge for selling 7 different crops and having markets for all of them. But certainly having more crops in rotation does have the benefit of breaking up pest and disease cycles. It also alters the different types of nutrients that are required in different amounts for the crops, and it can also support a bit more on-farm biodiversity. If you have 7 fields growing 7 different crops during every single year, can promote different flowering times and support more biodiversity on the farm. And so having a more diverse crop rotation and including different types of crops in this rotation, like legumes and brassicas and different types of cereals, can benefit the overall health of the soil, break up pest and disease issues, which can mean a little bit less application of pest or disease control products, which then often can help reduce a little bit of the amount of these inputs that you're using from the field or from off the farm. And integrated crops and animals is a practice where it's pretty much exactly what the title says. You're introducing animals into the farm to integrate it within the areas that crops are produced. This can be done in a number of different ways. For example, bringing in different herds of ruminants like sheep or like cattle to graze off a cover crop is another way to terminate a cover crop and to build up fertility within that area by depositing manure. Animal manure can also be used as a feedstock, especially if it's higher in N, to balance the carbon to nitrogen ratio in the compost as it decomposes. There are a couple of other benefits as well using animals on pasture areas in more marginal lands can help still to provide economic returns for producers when that area might not be suitable for crop production. And then, if you Google this one, you can find all sorts of interesting stories and practices. I was once at a farm that was using ducks in an orchard to help with some pest and weed control, which I thought was really interesting. And there are a number of different ways to really integrate animals for different purposes, depending on the needs of the farm or of the agricultural system, to provide benefits related to reducing farm inputs because you get the benefit of manure from these animals, and then supporting utilization of the different pieces of agricultural land in a way that's suitable for their conditions. Pollinator strips, we've got 2 to go. So pollinator strips here are another practice. This one is more of a practice that would be implemented at a field boundary or margin, especially in areas that maybe aren't suitable for crop production, but could grow different flowering species. This one, as you may guess, is really linked to promoting on-farm biodiversity, creating habitat for different pollinators on the farm to be able to access flowering plants at different parts of the year. I'm not an expert in this one, but there are some rough guidelines to follow about ideal pollinator strip sizes, and also the mix of different species within this area being no more than 10% of a single plant species, no more than 20% of a single genus, and no more than 30% of a single family. Another benefit of this practice is purely aesthetic. I mean, who doesn't love to go and see, one large strip of flowering, beautiful plants at any point in the year? So having that benefit maybe doesn't promote that much in terms of soil health, but certainly it promotes human health, and it is quite a benefit that we can see on farm. So pollinator strips really a practice that contributes to on-farm biodiversity, and in some cases could be used to reduce and replace off-farm inputs. Maybe not as common, but pollinator strips could be part of an integrated pest management plan. In some cases, they could be used as trap crops, so pulling some of the pests away from the main crop and into the pollinator strip can help reduce pest pressure on the main crop. In other cases, they can create habitat for predatory insects that might prey on larvae or other pests that could affect the main crop. So creating a habitat for these types of predatory insects or animals to reduce pest pressure on the main crop is the way that a pollinator strip could help to reduce the amount of pest and disease control products that are required on the farm. And finally, rotational grazing. So this is one really specific for the livestock production systems. Rotational grazing is really a practice of continuous movement of animals into different areas of the field during different times of the years. Often we call these paddocks. I'm not sure how well you can see this picture, but you can see sort of 8 of these paddocks. And this is a sheep farm here that are used to move the sheep from one paddock to the next for different periods. So first you would need to determine your carrying capacity of any particular paddock to know how long and how many animals can be in that area for the grazing period. I've seen systems where every 2 to 3 days animals are moved from one paddock to the next, others where it's 1 or 2 weeks because the paddock size varies quite a bit. And the benefit here is that when the animals are moved into the grazing paddock, the paddock that they used to be in gets a period of rest. So the idea is that you're moving animals into an area, intensively grazing it down to, let's say, 30% of the total biomass of the different forages and plants in that paddock. And then before any overgrazing happens, where you have bare soil, the animals are moved out of that area and the pasture rests and gets to rejuvenate. In this way, the plant species in those paddocks are being kept in a more productive vegetative stage where they're being grazed, grow back, but they're not going to seed and putting energy into seed production. Instead, it's really about biomass production. During those intensive periods of grazing, a lot of the roots will slough off or fall off and die, and that adds to the soil carbon pool. And there's a couple of other benefits that I've heard producers talk about with this practice. One can just be and how often, for example, sheep need to be treated for different parasitic worms, because you don't have the sheep in the same areas which the manure is deposited for as long, and so the worm burden is much less, which means less chemical drenches, for example, for the sheep. And so there's also benefits in terms of, managing your forages so they don't go to seed, and you don't have as much vegetation matter that ends up in wool, for example. So a number of different benefits to the system. Some of the drawbacks, though, number one is about watering points. So with, having a number of different fenced off areas, there needs to be watering points often within each of them. A hub and spoke system in terms of the design can work well for this. So, 5 paddocks can be connected to one central watering point. And so you don't need 5 watering points, you need one, and it can serve 5 different paddocks. And then another potential drawback, depends on how you look at it, is the amount of labor that's required to move and manage animals this frequently. Going out to move these animals every couple of days or once a week can be more intensive than set stocking or other types of animal production systems. But this does come with a number of benefits. It's a project that I've been working on for a couple of years with sheep producers in Australia, and we've seen some changes in terms of, early changes, I should say, in terms of potential soil carbon benefits for this practice. So with that, we'll stop talking about regenerative practices. As you maybe saw from that earlier list, and you should have the slides by now, there are more practices than the ones I've just discussed today, but I wanted to highlight these and pull them out because they are more of the common practices that I've seen. But this is an important part that we'll move into next. It's about measuring the outcomes of these practices. And I'll just remind you again of what I mentioned earlier, is that some of these practices require more benefits than other practices in certain areas of the world. And that's due to differences in climate, soil types, production systems. And so we don't know if these practices are regenerating soil health or improving biodiversity on the farm until we actually measure it. So with any of these practices that you implement, measuring their outcomes on different frequencies, depending on when you expect to see changes, is absolutely critical to improving the ways that we can talk about regenerative agriculture as a way to improve ecosystem services. So without measurement, there's a big risk that these different practices, we don't know the outcomes and we still claim that they do great things. What I've done here is just highlight a couple of the ways that regenerative agriculture practices can be measured related to these different ecosystem services. But there is, this list could be, tens of pages long, without a doubt. And the number of different key performance indicators or KPIs, or just indicators that could be used to measure soil health, is massive. So I've just given some suggestions here and some ways that you could do it. Often, most of these here require a little bit of training. In some cases, they do require a lab for analysis in the case of many of the soil KPIs. But there are a lot of great resources out there that can help producers or even gardeners understand some of the benefits that are occurring through fairly simple in-field measurements. So you don't need a lot of specialized equipment. You can get everything you need at the hardware store, and you're able to measure some of the benefits through a set of different sort of ways to analyze the soil or the water, or count different biodiversity elements on the farm. But really quickly here, you can just see the list that we would often use at the organization I work with as a base for evaluating the outcomes related to the production system. Just maybe one or two that I'll point out to you that are easier to do. When you're looking at soil, one of the things that we look at is just the percent cover at different periods of the year. And you can do this really easy by just taking a tape measure and running it across, let's say 10 or 50 meters of a field. And at every meter point or a regular interval, you just go and you put your finger down at that point on the tape measure and say, is it bare soil? Is it dead biomass that's covering that point on my finger? Or is it a living thing? And just tracking that over time can help to understand how well and how often the soil is covered. For CO2 emissions, if you like sitting behind a computer and entering lots of your own data, there's a tool that's called the Cool Farm tool. It's a free tool that is available to anyone in the world. And if you go to the Cool Farm tool website or just Google it, it'll bring up basically a greenhouse gas calculator. And there's a bunch of different tabs, but you go through, you enter information about your cropping system, your soil type, all of your different management practices, any inputs that you're using on the farm. You can capture a few regenerative practices like agroforestry, like cover cropping and like no-till, and also put in compost or different manure products that you're using. And what this calculator will do is will give you 3 different measures. One is your total GHG emissions on the farm, which is always expressed as CO2 equivalent or CO2e emissions. 2, it'll give you a CO2e emissions per hectare. And 3, it'll give you CO2 emissions per kilogram or per ton of the crop that you're producing. So it's really interesting to play around with this, put in your information and see what your baseline is. And then you can go back, because you can do up to 5 free calculations and adjust different ways of working in your system, or replacing different inputs, or implementing different things, reducing your use of your tractor if at all possible, and see what it means in terms of your carbon footprint at the farm, if you're interested in looking at something like that. For biodiversity, one of the easiest measures that doesn't require special training is looking at flora species richness. And so what you can do is you can just take kind of a square, you can build it yourself, just take a 1 meter by 1 meter stick, tape them together in 4 corners and drop it down in different parts of your field or field boundary. And species richness is really just the number of different species in an area. So you don't actually have to identify the different plants. Instead, you're just counting how many different ones there are. And so, if you were to plant a pollinator strip, for example, and wanted to look at the evolution of how many different types of plants are there over time, you could go in, drop your square down, and count the number of different, count how many different plants you have in that square area, keep track of that over time. If you're starting to use different cover crops, you could do that as well, but you would probably know what cover crops you're seeding every year. For water, the Cool Farm tool that I mentioned above also has a way to track some water use. This one often requires a little bit more analysis to look at different quality indicators for water. But if you have a water course on the farm, for example, one thing you can do is just measure how much of that area is unprotected. And my last slide here, I won't spend too much time on it, but these different organizations are one that may be of interest to some producers. I've divided them up into a couple of different categories. On the left here, you see carbon. So carbon frameworks, as I mentioned earlier, carbon itself is driving a lot of different organizations, whether they're governments, whether they're corporates, to support the implementation of regenerative practices for their carbon benefits. In the corporate world, something called the science-based targets or science-based target initiative is one that many different organizations have signed up for, to basically say, I am taking responsibility for carbon emissions that are part of my supply chain or my scope 3. In many cases, if it represents a certain portion of their overall, their total overall carbon emissions. And that's driving corporate organizations to support the implementation of practices that can help to either reduce or sequester carbon at the farm level. Next, you see a whole set of ecosystem service markets. One of the challenges with participating in an ecosystem service market for carbon benefits is the cost to enter these different ecosystem service markets. And you've probably heard of selling carbon credits. Soon you'll hear more about selling biodiversity credits or potentially water credits. So, we could probably have a whole conversation about, offsets and carbon credits, which have been getting some attention in the news. But ecosystem service markets are potential ways to generate revenue from the implementation of practices that result in improvements to ecosystem services, because they allow you to value them and to put a dollar figure behind them. So they can potentially be a revenue stream for producers. MRV is measurement, reporting, and verification. comes back to this outcome-based, the importance of outcome-based measurements, which I mentioned earlier, but MRV organizations can be used to measure the benefits of regen ag. They're often ag tech companies. Cool Farm Tool, you can see up on that list there, but these are a number of different organizations that can help better understand what's happening at the farm in terms of the outcomes that different practices are leading to. Biodiversity, you can see the circle doesn't have as many different organizations as the carbon one. This is starting to change and to grow with more attention being paid to biodiversity. One of the challenges that I think we'll see for the next couple of years is it's such a complex topic. There's so many different ways to measure biodiversity, and you can put in a little sound recording device and look at bioacoustics. You can go in and do a really detailed species inventory at the farm, but with biodiversity, lots of different ways to measure it. And so to understand, its value is important, but to measure it is, because of the complexity, it's taking some time to get to a point that we can come to some consistent measures. And finally, certifications, which I didn't really talk too much today, but there are a growing number of regenerative linked certifications. Probably the one you may know best is something called ROC, or Regenerative Organic Certified. This was one of the first ones out the gate. It's really focused on certifying practices. One of the requirements to getting ROC is to have your organic certification already, and then to implement a number of practices on top of that before getting audited for ROC. You haven't probably seen too many products yet that have this label on it, but the outcome of getting this certification is having a label to be able to put on the products that are grown under a ROC certified framework. There's a few farms in Canada, if you go on ROC's website, that have the certification, and they show you where the different farms are. There's a number of other certifications that are growing out there, like Regen Agri, for example, that's more focused on outcomes. So with that, I will stop my presentation, and I'll thank you all for your attention and for having a chance to speak virtually with you. Maybe one day we'll bump into each other at a conference or see each other in another way, but it was my pleasure to speak with you today, and I wish you all the very best. So take care.